Welcome to the second part of our talk, Politics and Economic Life, in the series on the social doctrine of the Church and political science. Today, in our session, we will deal with a number of macroeconomic issues. When we talk about macroeconomic issues, it means government's intervention on the economy on a national, global level, rather than at an enterprise level, which we call microeconomics, which we will discuss in the next session. So today we will look specifically at the economic role of government, fiscal policy, which we touched upon slightly in the last session, but we'll talk specifically now about taxation and public expenditure, political decisions surrounding nationalization or the privatization of enterprises, public debt, and also monetary policy. However, I would like to start with an important quote given to us by Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, paragraph 54, where he says, "In this context, some people continue to defend the trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth, encouraged by a free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion," Pope Francis says, "which has never been confirmed by facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of whose wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system, while we leave waiting those who are still poor in our society." The message of Pope Francis is very clear. While the free market in itself is an important economic concept, it clearly cannot be left to its own whims. Clearly, economic free market alone and the concept of trickling down the benefits of the free market to society are not sufficient in addressing society's inequalities, poverty, injustice, and all the other aspects. And therefore, there is economic role that governments need to assume to be able to address these issues. Now, when we talk about the role of government, the social teachings of the Church have a very clear idea of what government should be all about. Governments should not be there to assume and take control of everything, but in principle, governments should be there to support individual freedom, and therefore they are there to guarantee the security of individual freedom and private property. They should not be invasive, but neither should they be absent, and therefore their actions have to be commensurate with what society really needs. Governments should sustain business activity by creating the right environment, the right conditions to create job opportunities, not by employing people directly with government, but by helping businesses to grow, and therefore they employ more people. To intervene when there are situations of monopolies, where there's no competition in the market, because that can harm consumers, the individual, and also harmonizing and guiding development. And here, the Church clearly says, in Centesimus Annus, in exceptional circumstances, the state can also provide a substitute function. So it is not the preferred option of the Church that the state assumes state companies that provide goods and services themselves, but when the market cannot provide for those goods and services, then the state has an obligation to intervene in those exceptional circumstances. And therefore, if we had to divide economic government intervention, because there are other reasons why government intervenes, we can say there are two main reasons. The first is to correct market failure, so where the market cannot address an issue, cannot provide a good or service, or if it has to provide it, it will provide it at such a high cost that obviously the consumer will be at a great disadvantage, then the state there has a role in intervening to provide that good, that service, being healthcare, being education, being even a telephone system. If in a country there isn't a means of communication, passing water to areas where there is poverty, because the private sector has no incentive to deliver that water to those remote regions. So there the government has a role to intervene. The second economic function of government, to redistribute income. We know that the free market, which we said is an institution in the previous talk, and therefore the Church looks positively at the free market, however, does not have the ability to reduce inequalities. Actually, unfortunately, it tends to, in situations, increase inequalities, as resources are benefiting those who are able to pay, while those who are not able to pay would not benefit from those resources, and therefore inequalities increase. And there the state has an obligation, be it through taxation, be it through social measures, to reduce that inequality, to ensure that everyone is benefiting from the common good that society is created economically. Now, as we said in previous sessions, the economy broadly can be divided into three types of economies: the command economy, the capitalist economy, and the mixed economy. In today's modern society, we note that a lot of governments tend to go for what is called a mixed economy. Even countries that have come from a totalitarian philosophy, like China, who is a communist regime, today advocates that at the economic sphere, it has to open up more for the free market. And therefore, we see a mix also there coming in. And therefore, we see a mix of state enterprises and private enterprises. We see government intervention in terms of consumer protection. We see concepts of an incomes policy, like the minimum wage structure to protect workers. A discussion on the public and private health, where you have the private participating, but also the public sector participating. And also the state providing for pensions, social security, unemployment benefits, to ensure that we are addressing income inequalities. What are the key economic policy tools? And in that sense, there are fundamentally two: fiscal policy and monetary policy. What are fiscal policy and monetary policy? Fiscal policy is how the government collects money and how the government spends money. Monetary policy, as we said in the previous presentation, is the creation of money for the economy to be able to work. So, as I said, money is the blood vein of the economy. Unless there is money which we use to interchange for goods and services, we have to go back to the old primitive system of bartering, which we know is very ineffective. In fiscal policy, we have taxation, public spending, and public debt or public surplus. More commonly in today's world is public debt. And the biggest challenge of any policymaker is to decide how much involvement the government should have in that economy. When we talk about taxation and public spending, it's important to understand that these have to be taken within the context of the common good. And therefore, the goal to be sought in public financing is that of becoming an instrument of development and subsidiarity and solidarity. So, development and solidarity. The government is there to enable the individual to become more independent through education, through development, through opportunities, and that reduces inequalities, reduces poverty, and increases solidarity. So a just, in the compendium read, a just, efficient, and effective public financing will have very positive effects on the economy because it will encourage employment growth, sustain business, and also non-profit activities, and help to increase the credibility of the state as a guarantor of a system of social insurance and protection. And therefore, the Church actually shows how much it is in line with this concept that we need a government to address these inequalities through social programs. Now, it was not only the church who actually advocated such a concept, but also, especially after the Depression of the 1930s, a number of economic theorists who realized that the capitalist system, left on its own, could not solve the inequality problems, and although it was efficient in creating wealth, that wealth was not being justly distributed. And one of the most important economists in this sphere was actually Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist who came out very strongly after the Great Depression, who realized that markets were too slow to react to reality, and that therefore before reacting they actually caused a bigger disaster, because the market failures would turn into a recession. A recession would be a situation where the economy, rather than growing, is going down. People are losing jobs, people are not buying goods and services, business start to close, and you have a total economic collapse. And Keynes said, the capitalist system is too slow to react. Somebody needs to do something. And in the opinion of Keynes, that somebody had to be a government. The government had to assume a role to jumpstart the economy to address those failures. And to do so, according to Keynes, government had to use fiscal policy in terms of spending to increase demand and therefore create new jobs. There are a number of concepts he talked about the aggregate demand, which is what we all produce, and how that is important for the driving of the economy. So what drives an economy? What drives an economy is what we consume. Because we consume goods and services, and we look for them and demand for them, somebody says, good. They want pencils, I will create pencils. They want furniture, a bedroom, I will create a bedroom. They want to go out to eat during the evening, so we open restaurants. It is demand that creates the motive for supply. But in a recession, when there is no demand, what creates the reason for people to supply goods or services? By creating an alternative demand. And therefore, in times of recession, government spending can help reboost the economy. As we said, he believed that the markets had no self-balancing mechanism, and therefore government intervention was needed for full employment and what we call price stability. That means that we don't have prices going skyrocket high through inflations, or actually in a recession prices go so low that therefore nobody has an incentive to try and produce goods and services. Keynes also made a very bold statement. He said, capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. So it is believing that people who are lost in the motive of profit without any other consideration, because they will want more profit, everybody else will benefit. That is the basic capitalist system. But Keynes says that does not work, because clearly their intention is their self-benefit, not the benefit of others, which is not far from Pope Francis, who was not so bold, who said it in a bit more, more politically correct words. When he said that this defending of the trickle-down effect of the economy, that means letting the people who can make profit grow the profit, some of it will fall for others to benefit, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power. And therefore, while it is good to have people who create jobs because they create work and therefore make profits, that is a positive thing, we cannot just assume that those same people are able to also ensure that the common good is reached and social equality is actually prevailing. So Keynes clearly came out with a number of recommendations of how government can intervene in a number of situations. What he said is at times, because economics is many times about behavior, that the private sector at times takes decision in his interest, but which will have an adverse economic effect on others. So when there's a recession, the businessman will say, I don't think I'm going to sell a lot of goods, so let me downsize my operation. By downsizing his operation, he lays off workers. As he lays off workers, the workers have no money to spend, so they demand less goods. What happens? All the other employers, including this employer who reduced the number of employees, will sell less because people don't have money to spend. So you realize that when a situation happens, the decisions of a few can have a bigger impact on how the economy functions nationally. Prices, especially wages, respond very slowly to economic realities. So if there's a recession, prices do not fall so immediately. We'll have to wait until the businessman feels that he cannot sustain those prices much so high. So the economy reacts very slowly. And therefore, government needs to intervene, and we've seen it in the global economic crisis that we faced in 2009, that a lot of governments in that moment of crisis came up with what they called stimulus packages. So they decided to take a number of active economic measures to stimulate the economy. Now, in some big countries, they decided literally to send paychecks to households to give them money to spend to create demand. Some countries, like we've done in our case in Malta, the government stepped up in terms of public expenditure, and therefore government did more projects that created jobs, that created income for people. People continued spending, and therefore the recession was ironed out. So these are ideas or measures governments take to effectively address a situation of a recession. In economics, there's also an important concept called the multiplier effect, which means when a government spends €1 or $1 on a project, that $1 will be used by whoever received it to buy something else. Again, who receives that dollar or part of it will again spend it on something else. So when you spend in an economy, the multiplier effect, the ripple effect, is that others will also spend what they receive. So the impact on the economy is not of $1, but of more than $1. Now, if the impact is 2, that means that in a situation where you have an economic recession, when government starts to spend, the impact is bigger than the immediate amount he spends. And therefore, in that situation, it's a good thing that government takes such a measure. If we had to look at the history of economics, really, between the 1850s and 1930s, when the capitalist idea came out, governments tended not to intervene. So very low taxation, the only taxes really were to run public service, the army primarily, public order, but not much more because everything was left in the hands of the private sector. So public spending was low, but also there was no social welfare, no pensions, no free health systems, no support services if you're unemployed, and nothing which really benefits or addresses inequalities. Post-recession, as we said, economists started to realize that this does not work. Something needs to be done. And we saw the introduction of fiscal policy. What started to emerge also was the concept of public deficit, which means a government starting to spend more than they collect, with the argument that there's a limit to how much they can collect, and therefore they start to borrow money from the public to invest in projects, in roads and infrastructure. This had obviously its long-term downside because government started to accumulating debt while, yes, the economy started to grow. By time they started to realize that this could create a problem, and in the 80s and till 2008, government started to try and aim towards lower and balanced budgets and saying, well, we can't keep spending without collecting any taxes sufficiently to address the debts we are accumulating, and therefore they started changing policy. But that was a bit too late, because we had the crisis of 2009, where we saw the collapse not only of the banks, of a lot of economies, but also of a lot of states around the world. We had Argentina, we had countries like Greece, Portugal, and a number of other countries that actually collapsed with the crisis because their debt levels of governments were too high, and therefore markets did not believe that they could ever be repaid. What happened? Government had to address it by taking what are called austerity measures. That means, effectively, measures that hurt the general public because you increase taxation, or you cut down on social benefits, or close some social service provision you are doing to reduce debt and deficits and public debt. And this is how we observe this global phenomena of fiscal policy effectively working. Now, when it comes to taxation, the tax system, the Bishops' Conference, the US Bishop Conference tells us in the economic justice document they issued in 1986, should continue to evaluate itself in terms of its impact on the poor. So it's not as saying, okay, we need to reduce the deficit, we collect taxes. The manner in which taxes are applied is an important principle in the social teachings of the Church. And primarily, what the Church teaches is that the tax system should always be evaluated in terms of its adequacy, i.e., what does the common good really need, and therefore it shouldn't be excessive. But it also looks at the basic needs of the poor, and therefore the tax system should be a progressive tax system, which means that those who earn more pay more, and those who earn less pay less, or even, the Church teaches, pay nothing if they fall within a certain threshold of income, which brings them close to the line of poverty. There are different methods of taxation. There is direct taxation, like income tax, tax on companies' profits, and there is indirect taxation, customs, duties when we're importing goods, sales taxes like VAT and other similar sort of taxes. Obviously, there's an argument in terms of which is better or lesser on both fronts. No system is really a perfect tax system. As we said, in terms of direct taxation, if progressive, it is socially fairer, many times clearer in addressing inequalities, but also can discourage private initiative, has a negative impact on spending, because obviously government is taking part of my income, and encourages also tax evasion. Indirect taxation can be more effective in terms of how much government collects money, because it is broader. It also does discourage the initiative to invest, so it discourages less the initiative to invest, but also has some other difficulties, like, although consumers can choose whether to pay or not to pay that tax, in reality, if I am poor and need to buy something and there is a tax on it, I am still being forced to pay the tax even though I am poor. And therefore, these systems have to be tweaked so that essential basic needs like food, medicine, and other essential needs are not taxed through a sales tax, or otherwise these create an injustice. A phenomenal concern, obviously, in the world today is the avoidance of tax. And this the Church condemns severely in Gaudium Express, where it clearly says that the various schemes of frauds and deceptions in avoiding taxes is something which is intrinsically wrong. Why does government need to spend money. There are realities, there are needs that government needs to address. Goods and service, which public administration alone can provide. Infrastructure, hospitals, schools, addressing inequality, investing in human capital like education. Also reduce negative externalities, the impact of pollution, waste. Government needs to do something about it. And also, many times, the need of government even to subsidize certain industries, which without government support would not be effectively able to take off. And therefore, these are the various roles government needs to take. However, the Church teaches that in public spending, government needs to have precision and integrity, so not to waste money, but to really use it effectively. Ensure that resources are redistributed to benefit also the poor, a fundamental principle we keep repeating, and also pay greater attention to families. Families is an important concept in the social teachings of the Church. Unfortunately, in the series, it's not an area we will be focusing a lot on, but in reality, there's a whole chapter in the compendium dealing with families and the concept of families by the social teachings of the Church, because the Church acknowledges that the family is a very important, stable nucleus in society that needs to be protected. And therefore, the Church contemplates a situation where the government intervenes to provide public good and also social services. However, these have to be done within boundaries, i.e., the government has to always be attentive that he will not overstep in its role in terms of taking over what actually the private sector, the individual, can himself do. And therefore, state enterprises can be also for the common good. So while the Church's preference is for private enterprise to address economic needs, it does acknowledge that there are situations where the state needs to intervene. In countries that are poor, it is only government can provide the basic infrastructure of water, heating, telecommunications, electricity, and therefore the government has to create, many times, state enterprises to provide those goods and services. However, under the principle of subsidiarity, at the point the government can see that the private sector can provide that good or service, the government should retract and allow the private sector to enter into that market. However, there are a lot of concepts in terms of why the state may want to enter into enterprises. And there are a lot of reasons that are many times given. However, it is not necessarily the case that for every reason necessarily the government needs to own the company. So we may say that the government needs to own nuclear energy. Let me just give this by way of example, to protect society. In reality, if we take a case study of atomic energy industry, we can examine two situations. The nuclear power plant disaster in Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011. Both these companies were nuclear energy providers. Both these companies had a disaster, but they were not both state companies or both private sector companies. Actually, the Chernobyl power plant was owned by the state, while the Japanese company was owned by the private sector. In both cases, we had a huge catastrophe, a disaster. A lot of people lost their lives with the whole impact on the environment. So in essence, it wasn't whether the company is owned by the government or not that gives security to people that the operation is run safely, but whether effectively somebody is controlling whoever is operating that plant, that the standards are being maintained, that safety is being given its due consideration, that there are the measures to mitigate against an incident that could happen. And therefore, many times in society, it is not about whether the company is state-owned or not state-owned, but whether the state has strong regulators to ensure that private sector providers are actually working within the parameters that they should be allowed. And therefore, this depends also on the state of development of a country. Where the country's public infrastructure or public administration is still developing, then most probably these sort of industries need to be in the hands of the government, because there's no way the government can yet control the private sector. But in a government that has evolved in terms of its public administration capacity, then it is good to allow these enterprises to be run by the private sector, but the government has a strong arm of regulator that can actually impose on the private sector the standards, the health and safety requirements, and the parameters within which the company can operate. And therefore, the social teachings of the Church have yardstick in terms of what public sector companies should be doing and whether they should be in the hands of government. And these include, are they really there to address human dignity, the common good, the preferential option for the poor? Are they there to preserve the universal destination of goods, solidarity, subsidiarity, participation, the basic principles of the social teachings of the Church? Now, many times in these decisions, you will find that some boxes are ticked, but not all. But if none of the boxes, or very few of those boxes are ticked, then clearly the decision why that company is in the hands of the state is wrong and should not be owned by the state. Now, there are pitfalls in having companies owned by governments, and these vary. Many times you find corruption, a lot of political interference, the fact that there's no clear sense of ownership because it's owned by the state. You will find that workers lack motivation and the incentives to actually run efficiently. Unfortunately, politicians tend to see state companies as a means to give favors, like jobs. You will find a higher incidence of management abusing in terms of misappropriation and embezzlement of funds. And at the end of the day, it means that the consumer is paying for the corruption, for the theft, for the inefficiencies of that operation, because many times when you have a state company, it is in a situation of a monopoly. And this is why having state companies should be the last resort, not actually the active policy of a company. And therefore, we've seen over the past years also a lot of governments entering into what are called privatization programs. That means the selling of state companies to the private sector and opening markets for competition to give consumers a fairer deal in terms of prices. This is something good in itself, as long as we said it benefits the common good, and it is done within that concept. If you privatize a company but leave it as a monopoly or give it exclusive resources without controlling it, then that can be very detrimental to society. And therefore, as we said, it needs to really fit within the concept of common good, the universal destination of goods, and other principles of the social teachings of the Church. Public debt, because we're running late in today's session. Public debt in itself is not a bad thing as long as it is used to invest for future generations. So the concept of the intergeneration of common good. As we said, there are situations where governments cannot impose more taxation on the economy, on the people, on enterprises, and therefore resort to a level of public debt to invest for the future, to build the infrastructure without which you will not attract business in your country and therefore the economy will not grow. You are not finding people who invest in your health system. But very important, deficits and debt should not be used to consume for annual consumption. So if you have a deficit just to pay wages or to pay social benefits, in the long run, that is damaging. Because what is happening is that today's generation is consuming what tomorrow's generation will be producing. And that means that tomorrow's generation will have nothing to consume. And therefore, that is an intergenerational injustice. And therefore, overburdening a country with debt can lead to an economic collapse, a map of the global debt of the world, and you note that actually the world is riddled with debt, and that is a problem. That is a problem for future generations who will have to pay for the debt while also sustain themselves. And therefore, managing public debt responsibly is a very important measure. Monetary policy, quickly. Monetary policy can also be used to help grow or control the economy. Monetary policy is like oxygen in the fire. If you want a fire in a fireplace to grow, you have to throw wood, but you also have to pump in oxygen to be able to increase the flame. But if the flame is too high, then what you should do is reduce the amount of oxygen going into your fire burner. So that way you reduce the fire. Many times, or central banks' primary responsibility is to control money supply to make sure that prices in the economy, like fire, remain stable. They don't increase too much, but they don't go low too much. Why? If they increase too much, you can create a recession because goods and services become unaffordable, people do not buy, and you create a recession because shops are not selling, factories are not selling, and therefore you create a recession. But in the inverse, if prices are going significantly down, what happens? People may want to buy, but whoever's producing those goods and services stops to do so because he's losing money. And therefore, again, you enter into a recession. So the role of central banks is to manage this process. And this they do through the supply of money, which primarily is used through the increase or decrease of interest rates. So if I increase interest rates, I reduce money supply from the economy because people will say, interest rates are high, let me put my money in the bank and earn interest. If you want to increase money supply, you reduce interest rates. People say it's not worth it to keep my money in the bank, I'm getting nothing, let me therefore do something with it. Buy a piece of property, invest in a project, invest in a business venture, invest with the private sector through the buying of shares, because I see there an opportunity to earn more money. And that motivates the economy to effectively grow. So in monetary policy, we have what is called the expansionary monetary policy. That means when the bank is trying to encourage people to put money in the economy and therefore lower interest rates, or a contractionary monetary policy where people are overspending, prices are going high, that can create a danger. So you try and encourage people to reduce money in the economy and put it in the bank by increasing interest rates so that you reduce slightly demand and prices will stabilize again. I will close with the last point, devaluation. A number of countries, when they enter economic difficulty, generally because of public debt, resort to devaluation, which means they devalue the value of the currency internationally. And therefore, if my currency was worth $1, for every unit of my currency, I devalue it by 10%, and therefore for every unit of my currency, now we only get 90 cents of a dollar. That can be an effective way to address a situation. It reduces public debt, but it also causes hardship to people. And this is the problem when one mismanages the economy. There are economic tools to address it, but those economic tools cause hardship. Because in reality, through a devaluation, what you are doing, the people in your country have effectively become poorer by the percentage of the devaluation. Because for whatever they had in terms of money, or whatever they earn, now it earns them less. Even though they receive the same amount of money, that money, what you buy with it, is 10% less. That means all the goods and services you buy are now 10% more expensive. That is the impact of devaluation, and therefore when you use that measure, one has to be conscious that this can create also a social impact. And with that, we close today's session, which unfortunately was a bit longer because of the various topics we need to cover.